Evan Hale had always believed that certain friendships were built on quiet, unspoken threads, connections that didn't need words to survive. For years, Mason Reed had been one of those rare constants in his life. So when Mason called late one evening and suggested a mountain adventure to clear both our heads, Evan agreed before he had time to overthink. His instincts told him the invitation carried weight, but the tone in Mason's voice carried something even heavier, something uncharacteristically fragile. When they met at the trailhead 2 mornings later, Mason looked nothing like the confident, steady friend Evan was used to. His usual carefree grin was replaced by a strained half-smile that flickered every time he avoided eye contact. Evan noticed immediately, though he decided not to comment. He'd learned long ago that Mason opened up only when he was ready, and never a moment sooner. As they began the ascent into the pine-thick mountains, the crisp morning air felt charged, as though the landscape itself sensed the tension threading between them. Evan inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle in his lungs, grounding him. He had joined this trip hoping to escape his own restlessness, but he was becoming increasingly aware that Mason was carrying a storm of his own. Half an hour in, Mason finally spoke, his voice low. "Claire and I fought again." Evan kept his pace steady, resisting the urge to look over too quickly. Claire Donovan, Mason's long-distance girlfriend, was practically a symbol of stability in Mason's chaotic schedule. The fact that Mason was bringing her up so soon into the hike was unusual. "What happened?" Evan asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "It doesn't matter," Mason muttered, tightening his grip on the straps of his backpack. "Just the same argument, over and over. She thinks I'm not emotionally consistent. That I don't know what I want." Evan let the words settle. Emotional consistency was never Mason's strong point, but Mason had always been sincere. That was what made this shift so baffling. They trekked in silence for a while, their boots crunching against the gravel. Evan watched Mason from the corner of his eye, noticing the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than his pack. It wasn't the argument with Claire that bothered him most, it was whatever Mason wasn't saying. As they rounded a sharp bend, the trees parted enough to reveal a sweeping view of the valley below. Mason stopped abruptly, gazing out as though searching for answers in the vastness. Evan paused beside him, waiting. "I shouldn't have dragged you out here," Mason said eventually. "You probably had better things to do." Evan shook his head. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to be." Mason's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, his expression softened, almost relieved, but he quickly turned away and continued walking. That fleeting shift unsettled Evan more than the silence that followed. The farther they climbed, the more the terrain changed. What began as a well-worn trail gradually narrowed into a rugged, uneven path. Fallen branches forced them to slow down, and the air grew cooler as the forest thickened overhead. Evan found himself studying Mason more than the landscape, studying the subtle changes in his demeanor, the quiet hesitations that felt out of place. At one point, Mason slipped on a loose patch of gravel, stumbling forward before catching himself. Evan reached instinctively, steadying him with a hand on his arm. The contact lasted less than a second, but Mason froze, as if startled by how quickly Evan had reacted. Mason muttered a thanks, though something in his voice trembled. Not fear, not embarrassment, something else Evan couldn't decipher. They continued upward, the silence stretching again, but not comfortably this time. Evan felt the shift between them like static, the kind that lingered after lightning touched the ground. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was something undeniable, an awareness neither of them had expected. Around noon, clouds drifted across the sun, dimming the forest in a muted gray light. Mason checked his phone, then sighed. "Signal's gone," he said. "Claire was supposed to call." Evan heard the frustration beneath the words, a quiet desperation trying to disguise itself. "She'll reach you when she can," Evan replied softly. Mason nodded but didn't look convinced. Instead, he adjusted his pack and pressed forward. After a few minutes, he spoke again, this time without prompting. "She said I've changed. That I'm distracted. That I'm distant whenever she brings up our future." Evan swallowed. "Have you changed?" Mason hesitated, then answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." It wasn't the answer Evan expected, and the honesty behind it sent a ripple of unease through him. Mason was rarely unsure of his emotions. The ambiguity itself was alarming. They reached a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was colder here, sharper, almost metallic. Evan dropped his pack and stretched, but his eyes stayed on Mason, who stood at the center of the clearing as though he had forgotten how to move. "You brought me out here for a reason," Evan said quietly. "What's going on with you?" Mason exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. "I didn't know who else to talk to." Evan felt something tighten in his chest, not attachment, not hope, but a deep, instinctive understanding that whatever Mason was about to reveal was heavy enough to fracture something between them, even if only temporarily. Before Mason could continue, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, scattering pine needles and shifting the atmosphere from heavy to ominous. Evan glanced upward, noticing the clouds thickening in the distance. "Storm coming?" Mason asked, though his eyes didn't leave Evan's face. "Maybe," Evan answered, though he wasn't sure if he meant the weather or the conversation. Mason took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I didn't plan this trip to escape Claire." "Not exactly." Evan's heartbeat quickened, not from anticipation but from the sense that they were reaching a tipping point, one that neither of them fully understood. "Then why?" Evan asked. Mason hesitated, his expression conflicted, vulnerable in a way Evan had never seen. "Because I'm tired of pretending everything in my life makes sense." The wind swirled again, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Evan waited, sensing that Mason hadn't reached the real confession yet, but instead of continuing, Mason stepped back and turned toward the trail. "We should keep moving. We're losing daylight." He didn't wait for a response. Evan followed, though his mind replayed Mason's unfinished confession like an echo that refused to fade. Whatever truth Mason was carrying, it was starting to leak through the cracks, and as they left the clearing behind them, Evan realized that this trip wasn't just about clearing their heads. Something was shifting between them, something neither of them had the courage to name yet, something that would change the rest of the journey. Evan felt the air shift as they continued along the narrowing trail, the kind of shift that warned the body before the mind caught up. The forest grew darker, with branches interlocking above them like ribs of some ancient, patient creature. Wind threaded through the pine needles, producing a low hum that intensified the uneasy silence Mason carried on his shoulders. They walked for nearly an hour without speaking. Evan kept his attention on the path ahead, but his thoughts circled Mason like moths around a flame. Mason's half-confession from earlier had lodged itself into Evan's mind, refusing to settle. The way Mason's voice had cracked. The way he'd stepped closer, then retreated. It didn't add up, not with the Mason he knew. Eventually, the terrain shifted again, sloping sharply downward toward a rocky ravine. Mason stopped at the top, scanning the uneven descent. "This looks unstable," he murmured. "It's the only route before the next cliffside stretch," Evan replied. "We can take it slow." Mason nodded, though worry flickered across his face. Even so, he followed Evan carefully, testing each foothold. About halfway down, the wind intensified, picking up dust and scattering loose pebbles. Mason's footing slipped, his weight shifting dangerously. Evan reacted instinctively, grabbing his wrist to steady him. Mason froze again at the contact, his eyes lifting to Evan's with a flicker of something raw, something Evan wasn't prepared to interpret. The moment stretched, suspended between them, before Mason drew in a sharp breath and pulled his hand back. "Thanks," he said quietly, as though the word itself cost something. They finished the descent without another incident, but the tension between them had sharpened rather than eased. The storm clouds continued to thicken overhead, casting shadows that made the trail appear more sinister than scenic. As they reached a flatter stretch of forest, Mason finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Claire thinks I've been hiding something from her." Evan slowed his pace, listening. "She says I drift whenever she talks about moving in together. Or marriage. Or anything that involves long-term plans." Mason kicked a branch off the path. "And maybe she's right." Evan kept his voice calm. "Have you been hiding something?" "I don't know," Mason admitted. "I just feel split. Like I'm living two different versions of myself, and neither one lines up anymore." The confession struck Evan harder than he expected. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the vulnerability behind them. Mason wasn't someone who cracked easily, and hearing him unravel piece by piece tugged at Evan in ways he tried for years to ignore. Before Evan could respond, a distant rumble of thunder vibrated through the trees. Mason looked up, scanning the sky with a grim expression. "We need to find shelter," Mason said. "Fast." They picked up the pace, navigating through dense underbrush until they spotted a small, weathered structure ahead, a ranger outpost long abandoned. Its wooden exterior was cracked, moss clinging to the lower beams, but the roof appeared intact. "This'll have to do," Evan said. Inside, the cabin smelled of old timber and forgotten stories. Dust coated the surfaces, and a few scattered leaves lay across the floorboards. Mason dropped his backpack near the door and sat on a broken bench, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The storm broke moments later, rain hammering the roof with fierce determination. The sound filled the cabin, a relentless rhythm that amplified the tension inside. Evan sat across from Mason, studying him. "This trip, was it really about wanting to clear your head?" Mason didn't look up. "I told you, I didn't know who else to talk to." "That's not an answer," Evan said gently. Mason's shoulders slumped. "I don't have a better one." Lightning flashed through the cabin's small window, illuminating Mason's face, pale, conflicted, pulled in too many directions at once. Evan leaned forward. "Whatever you're struggling with, you don't have to deal with it alone." "That's the problem," Mason replied quietly. "Some things aren't meant to be shared." Before Evan could respond, the cabin door creaked open. Both of them turned sharply as a tall man stepped inside, shaking water from his jacket. His expression was apologetic, his eyes alert in the dim light. "Didn't mean to startle you," the stranger said. "Storm's gotten worse up the ridge." "I'm Jordan." Evan nodded politely. Mason's posture stiffened, though he tried to hide it. Jordan glanced around the shelter. "You two planning to stay put until it passes?" "That's the idea," Evan said. Jordan studied them for a moment, his gaze lingering on Mason with a perceptiveness that made him seem less like a fellow hiker and more like someone trained to read people. "Be careful tonight," he said simply. "Storms in this area aren't just weather. People get turned around. Trails shift. It's easy to lose more than your footing." Mason's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jordan offered a faint smile. "Just a warning. This mountain has a way of forcing clarity. Whether you want it or not." With that, he stepped back into the rain, disappearing behind the curtain of water. Mason let out a slow breath. "What was that about?" Evan shook his head. "Probably just superstition." But the words didn't convince either of them. The storm raged on outside, wind shrieking against the cabin walls. Evan watched as Mason paced restlessly, running a hand through his hair, the edges of his frustration showing clearly now. "I feel trapped," Mason said abruptly. "Not because of the storm. Because of everything else." Evan rose slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Trapped in your relationship? Or trapped in your life?" Mason paused, his back to Evan. "Both." The admission echoed in the small cabin, carried by the storm's fury. Evan stepped closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. "Claire deserves honesty. And so do you." "I know," Mason whispered. "But honesty means admitting things I've been avoiding for a long time." Evan swallowed, already fearing the direction Mason's emotions were drifting. "Like what?" Mason turned then, slowly, deliberately. His eyes met Evan's, and the intensity in them startled him. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't lust. It was something far more complicated, yearning mixed with guilt, confusion tangled with longing, like he was standing at a crossroads he never expected to face. "I don't trust myself anymore," Mason said softly. "Not with Claire. Not with you. Not with the person I keep becoming." Rain battered the roof like a drumbeat, underscoring every word. Evan's heartbeat quickened, though he kept his expression controlled. "Mason, what are you trying to say?" Mason opened his mouth, then closed it, the conflict inside him visible and painful. His jaw worked, as though he was fighting himself more than the conversation. "I think," Mason whispered, "I'm afraid of what I'll admit if I say it out loud." The storm intensified once more, shaking the thin cabin walls. Evan exhaled slowly. "When you're ready, I'll listen. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Mason's expression softened, relief, fear, and something unnamed flickering through him, but instead of continuing, he stepped back, creating a space between them that felt deliberate. "We should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be harder." Evan nodded, though a knot tightened in his chest. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, and inside the cabin, the unspoken truth between them grew louder than the thunder, and Evan knew, without question, that whatever Mason was holding back was close to breaking through. The storm eased only after dawn, leaving the world washed in a pale, brittle light. Evan stepped outside the cabin first, breathing in the cold, damp air while Mason lingered in the doorway as though unsure whether to follow. The tension between them hadn't softened overnight. If anything, the silence had distilled it into something sharper, heavier, almost gravitational. "We should move before the trail gets worse," Evan said, forcing calm into his voice. Mason nodded, though he didn't seem fully present. His eyes kept drifting toward the valley, as if searching for a version of himself he'd misplaced somewhere along the climb. They resumed their trek in silence, stepping over slick rocks and fallen branches. The forest looked different in the morning, bright, yet strangely distorted, as though the storm had rearranged more than just the landscape. Evan sensed that Mason was carrying the weight of everything left unsaid, and the unspoken strain pressed between them like a third companion. When they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a steep drop, Evan paused to catch his breath. Mason stopped beside him, his expression drawn. "You barely slept last night," Evan said quietly. Mason let out a humorless laugh. "Did you expect me to?" "I expected you to talk," Evan replied. Mason's jaw tightened. "I almost did." "Almost doesn't help either of us." Mason turned away, his shoulders rising as he inhaled deeply. "If I tell you the truth, things won't go back to how they were." "Maybe they aren't supposed to," Evan said. The words hung between them, suspended and dangerous. Mason's eyes flicked to Evan's with a sudden intensity, but before either could speak, a faint crack echoed through the trees, sharp, unmistakable. Evan spun toward the sound. A distant figure stepped onto the ridge ahead, emerging from the mist. "Jordan," the stranger from the cabin raised a hand in greeting, though his expression was more serious than the night before. "Thought I might see you too on this path," Jordan said. "Trail markers got washed out. People have been getting turned around. You good?" Evan nodded, but Mason's posture shifted subtly, closer to defensive than relieved. "We're fine," Mason said curtly. Jordan studied him for a brief moment, then looked to Evan. "Storm like that has a way of shaking loose whatever someone's been trying to ignore." Mason exhaled sharply. "You're full of helpful observations, aren't you?" Jordan didn't rise to the tension. "Just saying, clarity usually comes after the chaos. As long as you don't run from it." Evan sensed that Mason was seconds away from snapping back, so he stepped forward. "Thanks for the warning. We'll be careful." Jordan nodded and continued down the trail, vanishing once more into the thinning fog. Mason shook his head. "I hate when strangers act like they know something about me." "He wasn't wrong," Evan said quietly. Mason paused, then let out a slow breath. "Yeah. I know." They walked on, the ridge eventually widening into a safer path. Birds chirped above them, shaking rain from their wings. The forest was coming back to life, yet the weight between Evan and Mason remained as heavy as before. It wasn't until they reached a rocky overlook that Mason finally set his pack down and faced Evan fully. "I need to say this before I lose my nerve," Mason said, voice trembling with conviction he rarely showed. "Claire called again last night. Before the storm cut out the signal." Evan's heartbeat quickened. "What happened?" "She asked me straight out if there was someone else," Mason said. "Not physically, emotionally." He swallowed hard. "And I couldn't answer." Evan felt his stomach drop. "Mason, I didn't lie," Mason said. "But I didn't tell the truth either. Because the truth is complicated." And unfair. And I shouldn't even be thinking it. Evan forced himself to remain still. Thinking what? Mason's eyes met his, and the raw vulnerability in them unraveled Evan from the inside out. That I've been leaning on you more than I should, Mason said. That I've been relying on you in ways I never admitted to myself. That part of me feels closer to you than to her, and I don't know what that means. For me. For us. For everything. The confession hit Evan like a cold rush of air, expected yet overwhelming. Mason, Evan said softly, careful not to step closer. You haven't done anything wrong. Confusion isn't betrayal. It feels like betrayal, Mason whispered. Claire deserves honesty. You deserve honesty. And I've been living in this half-state where I want connection without the responsibility of choosing it. Evan's voice gentled. And now? And now the choice terrifies me, Mason admitted. Because choosing means admitting that my feelings aren't as simple as I always told myself. Evan let the silence between them settle, not to avoid the moment, but to give Mason space to breathe. I don't want to hurt anyone, Mason said. Not Claire. Not you. But I can't keep pretending nothing is shifting inside me. Evan nodded slowly. Then don't pretend. Just take the time to understand it. Mason closed his eyes briefly before speaking. I don't know who I am right now. You're someone trying to be honest, Evan replied. That's more than most people manage. A soft wind swept across the overlook, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. For the first time since the journey began, Mason's features softened, not with certainty, but with release. I think I need to talk to Claire, Mason said. Really talk. Not dance around things. She deserves that. Evan felt a pang of something he didn't want to name, but he nodded. That's the right call. But Evan, Mason added, voice low, whatever happens after that talk. I don't want this, he gestured between them, to vanish. Even if it changes. Evan's breath caught, not from hope but from the gravity of the moment. It won't vanish, he said. But it might evolve. And that's okay. Mason nodded, the tension in his body easing for the first time in days. They resumed their descent down the mountain, the air clearing as they made their way toward the valley. The storm had passed, yet its imprint remained, in the stripped branches, the shifted earth, and in the fragile honesty that now existed between them. Near the base of the trail, Mason's phone buzzed, lighting up with Claire's name. He exhaled, staring at it for a long moment. This won't be easy, Mason murmured. No, Evan said. But the right things rarely are. Mason stepped aside to answer, leaving Evan a few paces back on the trail. Evan watched him speak, quietly, earnestly, his posture trembling with truth. And though Evan couldn't hear the words, he understood something important. Whatever the future held, the mountain had done what the storm promised. It forced clarity. When Mason finally turned back toward him, eyes red but expression calm, Evan felt the ground beneath them settle in a way it hadn't since the trip began. Ready? Mason asked. Evan nodded. Ready. They continued toward the road, the weight between them lighter now, not erased, but transformed. And even as they reached the edge of the forest, Evan knew their story wasn't ending here. Something real had begun on that mountain. Something they would both have to face long after they walked down into the world again.